The first thing Evelyn Marsh did when she stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek, Montana, was walk directly up to the tallest, most disagreeable-looking man she had ever seen, tap him on the arm and say, "You must be Clayton Reed. I'm here about the room." He looked at her the way a man looks at something he did not order and does not want. "I didn't advertise a room," he said. "Sarah Miller did, on your behalf." She held up a folded piece of paper. "She said you needed the income and were too proud to admit it." A long silence followed. Then he said, "Sarah Miller needs to mind her own business." "Probably," Evelyn agreed. "Do I get the room or not?" Before Clayton could answer either way, she picked up her trunk, walked past him toward his wagon, and set it in the back without being invited. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, watching her. Then he put the hat back on and followed her. That was how it started. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. I promise you, it is worth every minute. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Clayton Reed had not wanted a boarder. He had not wanted company of any kind in the 2 years since the house had gone quiet. He had his cattle, his land, his dog. Biscuit, a 13-year-old hound who snored so loudly, the hands sometimes thought it was thunder, and he had the understanding that his life was the shape it was going to stay. He told Evelyn this on the drive back to the ranch. Not gently. "I work before sunup," he said. "I don't make conversation at breakfast. The room is at the end of the hall, the door sticks in humidity, and I'm not going to fix it. Meals are your own responsibility, unless you want to eat what the cook makes, which is mostly beans and regret." Evelyn was looking at the mountains. "That one," she said, pointing. "What's it called?" He stared at her. "Did you hear anything I said?" "Every word. You work early, you don't talk the door sticks. The mountain, Mr. Reed." He looked at it. "Locals call it the Widow's Peak, on account of the shape." "It's beautiful." "It's a mountain." "Yes," she said, "it is." And she smiled at the thing, like it had done her a personal favor. Clayton faced forward and said nothing else for 7 miles, which was longer than most people could make him stay quiet, though he did not know that yet. The ranch hands noticed her the moment the wagon pulled in. There were 4 of them. Pete, a red-faced Irishman who had been with Clayton for 6 years. Denny, young enough that his mustache was still an aspiration. Old Lou, who claimed to be 63, but was probably closer to 75, and moved like he was conserving movement for something important. And Thomas Bell, who was not technically a hand, but showed up every morning anyway because he lived on the neighboring property and found Clayton's unhappiness entertaining. Thomas was leaning on the fence post when the wagon stopped. He watched Evelyn Marsh climb down before Clayton could offer help, which Clayton had not moved to offer, and survey the yard with her hands on her hips like she was taking inventory. "Well," Thomas said loud enough for everyone. Clayton finally imported some good sense. "She's a boarder," Clayton said, getting down from the wagon. "She's renting the east room. That's the end of it." "The east room?" Thomas looked at Evelyn. "Ma'am, that room faces the chicken coop." "I grew up with 3 sisters," Evelyn said. "I've heard worse." Thomas Bell laughed so hard, he knocked his own hat off. The east room was exactly as described. Dusty, lit by one narrow window that looked directly into the business end of 8 chickens, and featuring a door that required a hip check to open. Evelyn set her trunk down, surveyed the space, and immediately pushed the bed to face a different direction. Then she sat on it and took stock. She was 27 years old. She had left Philadelphia 6 weeks ago with one trunk, $40, and a letter from her former fiancé that she had not finished reading before she threw it into the harbor. She had no plan beyond west and no destination beyond far enough. Sarah Miller, whom she had met on the stage when it stopped overnight in Billings, had mentioned a man named Clayton Reed who needed income and would rather lose the ranch than admit it, and that had seemed like enough of a sign. Evelyn was not naive. She was not looking for rescue. She was looking for somewhere to be useful while she figured out what came next. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Day 1. Room smells like cedar and old dust. Chickens are louder than expected. Man of the house is deeply committed to being unpleasant. We'll see." Dinner that night was beans. as promised. She ate them at the kitchen table across from Clayton, who ate standing up at the counter because apparently he did not consider it a real meal unless he was technically ready to leave at any moment. "You could sit," she said. "I'm fine. You look like you're about to bolt." "I'm eating." "You're hovering." She pointed at the chair across from her. "I'm not contagious." He sat, slowly, like the chair might be a trap. "Thank you," she said. "Don't make it a habit," he said. She looked at him steadily. He was a difficult man to read the set of his jaw. Said, "Don't try." And the look around his eyes said something else entirely, something older and more tired than hostile. She had seen that look before, on her father after her mother passed, the particular kind of grief that had cured itself into stubbornness. She didn't say that. She said, "The beans are better than I expected." "Walt adds molasses. Tell Walt that saved him." The corner of Clayton's mouth did something. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the vicinity. 3 days passed, then 4. Evelyn fell into the rhythm of the place, the way she fell into most things, not by asking permission, but by paying attention and making herself useful before anyone noticed she was doing it. She learned which horses were which. She learned that old Lou's knee predicted rain better than any almanac, and that Denny had a sweetheart in town he was too terrified to speak to, and that Pete sang Irish ballads to the cattle at dusk because he claimed it settled them, and because no one had the heart to tell him whether it worked. She also learned that Clayton Reed rose at 4:30 every morning, that he took his coffee black, that he had a habit of standing at the kitchen window for exactly 5 minutes before anyone else was awake, and that he kept the house in a state of such deliberate bleakness. No curtains, no rugs, no color anywhere that it felt less like a home than a place. A man was waiting out a sentence. On the 5th morning, she came downstairs before he expected her and found him at the window with his coffee. He startled. He actually startled a man who handled livestock for a living, startled by a woman in a kitchen. "Sorry," she said. "I'll go back up." "No." He stepped aside. "Coffee's on." She poured a cup and stood beside him at the window. Outside, the sky was doing something extraordinary, the kind of sunrise that looked painted on all orange and deep blue. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "Why don't you have curtains?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Had some once, took them down." She let that sit. She understood that some answers were also closed doors, and she had enough sense not to knock on all of them at once. She took her coffee to the table. He stayed at the window, but he didn't leave, and neither did she, and that 5 minutes stretched to 15 before the sound of Pete starting up outside broke it. The trouble started on a Tuesday. Thomas Bell arrived mid-morning while Clayton was out on the north fence, and Evelyn was in the vegetable garden, which had been such a disaster of neglect that she had taken it on simply because it offended her to see something living given up on. Thomas leaned on the fence post and watched her work for a while. Then he said, "You know he's going to try to scare you off." She kept pulling weeds. "He's been trying since day one. He's good at it. Managed to clear out 2 housekeepers and a dog in 6 months. The dog left voluntarily. Biscuit started sleeping at my place. Can't say I blame him." Thomas was quiet a moment. "Clayton's not mean," he said, and his voice had lost its amusement. "I want you to know that. He had somebody once, and he lost her, and he decided it was safer to make sure nobody stayed long enough to lose again." Evelyn sat back on her heels. She looked at Thomas carefully. "You're telling me this why?" "Because you're the first person in 2 years who looked at him like he was worth the trouble." Thomas pushed off the fence. "Don't let him convince you otherwise." He walked back to his horse, and Evelyn looked at the half-cleared garden for a long moment, and then she went back to work. That same afternoon, Clayton came back from the fence to find that his vegetable garden, which had been a brown disaster for 2 growing seasons, had been wrestled back from the dead to the tune of 3 cleared rows, stakes, and something that looked like it had ambitions of becoming a tomato plant. He stood there looking at it. Pete appeared at his elbow. "She's been at it since morning." "I didn't ask her to do that." "No, she just did it." Clayton looked at this garden. Then he looked at the house where he could hear Evelyn moving around in the kitchen. Then he took off his hat, rubbed the back of his neck, and put it back on. "It'll be dead by August," he said. "Maybe," Pete said. "But it's alive right now." That evening, he came to find her. She was sitting on the porch steps with her notebook writing by the last of the light. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then came out and sat down on the step above hers. Not beside her. Above. Like he needed the technical advantage. "You didn't have to do the garden," he said. "I know. I didn't ask you to." "I know that too." He was quiet. "Why'd you do it?" She looked up at him. "Because it was dying, and it didn't have to be." A beat. "Then, that's a lot of work for something that might not take." "Most worthwhile things are," she said, and looked back at her notebook. He sat there for another 10 minutes. He didn't talk. She didn't push him to. The night came in slow, and the first stars came out over the mountain that she had learned was called the Widow's Peak, and Biscuit, who had apparently made the journey back from Thomas's for the evening, climbed the steps and settled between them like he was brokering something. The next morning she came downstairs to find curtains in the kitchen window. Plain white cotton. Not fancy, but curtains. Clayton was standing at the counter with his coffee, looking at the table like he was daring it to say something. She looked at the curtains. She looked at him. She said nothing. She poured her coffee and sat down at the table. He sat across from her, technically ready to leave. Outside, the sunrise came through the cotton and turned the whole kitchen gold. Chaw. 2 weeks in Evelyn Marsh had established the following facts about Clayton Reed. He was not as advertised a man who didn't talk. He was a man who talked only when he had something to say, which meant everything he said meant something. And if you paid attention, that was a great deal of conversation. How was careful, not cold careful. There was a difference, and it took her 2 weeks to see it. He checked the latch on the chicken coop every night, whether he'd checked it that morning or not. He knew every hand's name and the name of every hand's family. He had quietly extended old Lou's pay 3 months ago, when Lou's hip got worse, and he could only work half days, and he had done it in a way that let Lou keep his dignity, and not a single soul on the ranch had heard about it from Clayton. She'd heard about it from Pete, who had heard it from Lou's wife. She was thinking about the specific care of a man who didn't want to be seen caring when she walked around the back of the property on a Sunday afternoon and found the grave. It was a simple marker. A wooden cross maintained, kept clear of overgrowth. The name carved into it was Margaret Ann Reed, 1853 to 1882. Beloved. Evelyn stood very still. She had known there was a story. Thomas had told her that much. But standing here in front of this cross in the back corner of the property, where anyone walking the fence line would pass without noticing, unless they were paying attention, she understood something she hadn't before. He hadn't moved away from this place after losing her. He had stayed. He had kept the grave. He had kept her here in the land he couldn't leave. And he had built a life around that grief that looked from the outside like a wall, but was actually something closer to a vigil. "You are in trouble," Evelyn Marsh told herself quietly. "You came here to figure out what came next, and you have found the most complicated man in Montana, and you are already thinking about him too much." She turned to leave. Clayton was standing 10 feet away. He had seen her find it. He had seen her stand at it. He had seen whatever crossed her face. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the quiet afternoon. Then he said roughly, "You shouldn't be back here." "The fence line runs through here," she said. "I was walking the fence." "There's nothing wrong with the fence." "I know. I just like to walk." She met his eyes. "She sounds like she was important." He said nothing. His jaw tightened. "You don't have to talk about it," she said. "I'm not asking." "Good." His voice came out harder than he meant it to. "Because there's nothing to say." She nodded once, turned and walked back toward the house. She did not look back. He stayed at the grave a long time after she left. Long enough that Pete came looking for him and found him there and quietly went away again. That night was the first time Evelyn Marsh could not sleep. She lay in the east room, listening to the chickens arrange themselves for the night, and thought about a man who had loved someone so completely that 2 years after losing her, He still couldn't put up curtains in his own kitchen. And then, without permission, she thought about her own story. The story she hadn't told anyone. Letter she hadn't finished reading. The way James Whitfield had looked at her across his mother's parlor and said, "Evelyn, I'm sorry, but you must understand. Caroline's family has a standing in this city," that she had stood up and walked out before he could finish the sentence. That had been 6 weeks ago. She hadn't cried yet. She kept waiting for it, and it kept not coming, and she had begun to wonder if that was because she hadn't loved him, or because she had learned somewhere along the way to treat her own grief like a draft, something to brace against, but not be stopped by. She thought, at least Clayton Reed had the honesty to build his grief into his house. At least you can see what he lost. The moment that changed everything came on a Thursday, which was not a dramatic day for it. No storm, no emergency, just an ordinary afternoon. Thomas Bell came by for reasons he claimed were about a fence dispute, but were obviously about curiosity, and found Clayton in the barn and Evelyn in the garden, and made the observation to Clayton that Evelyn Marsh was settling in nicely. "She's a boarder," Clayton said, without looking up from the harness he was mending. "She'll move on eventually. They all do." He didn't say it unkindly. He said it as a fact. The way you say winter comes, or the creek runs high in spring. Just a thing that was true. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "Clayton," he said carefully, "you know she can't hear you from the garden, right?" "I know that. Just wanted to make sure. Because you said that like you were reminding yourself, not like you were telling me." Clayton set down the harness. "What do you want, Thomas? Honestly, I want you to not be a damn fool." Thomas picked up a piece of straw, turned it in his fingers. "That woman has been here 3 weeks, and she's done more for this place than you have in 2 years. She's not here because she has nowhere to go. She's here because she chose to be. And you're in the barn talking to yourself about how she'll leave." "Everybody leaves," Clayton said. "Margaret didn't leave," Thomas said, quiet and direct. "She died. That's different. And you know it's different. You just don't want to know it." Silence settled in the barn. Then Clayton said low, "Drop it, Thomas." Thomas dropped it. But he looked on his way out toward the garden, where Evelyn was staking up something green and determined looking, and he looked back at Clayton, and he shook his head. But Evelyn had been closer to the barn door than either of them knew. She had come to ask Clayton if he wanted the fence stakes moved, or if the current placement was deliberate. She had been 2 steps from the door when she heard Thomas's voice and Clayton's answer. "She's a boarder. She'll move on eventually. They all do." She stood outside the barn for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to the garden and picked up her trowel and drove it into the dirt with considerably more force than necessary. She wasn't hurt. She was clear-eyed about it. She had known what she was, a temporary arrangement, a practical solution to a man's financial problem. She had not invented anything romantic about it, but she had thought she had allowed herself to think that she was at least a person to him. That the curtains had meant something. That the 5 o'clock mornings at the kitchen window meant something. She'll move on eventually. She stabbed the trowel in again. "Careful," said a voice behind her. "You're going to murder the carrots." She turned. Clayton was standing at the garden fence. He was looking at her the way he looked at things he was trying to read, that careful, guarded attention. "I'm fine," she said. "You're stabbing vegetables." "I'm loosening the soil. With vengeance." She looked at him. He looked back. He could tell something had shifted. She could see him noticing it, that particular alertness of a man who has learned to brace for departure. "Mr. Reed," she said, "what exactly are you expecting from me?" He blinked. "What?" "I've been here 3 weeks. I've cooked, I've cleaned, I've rebuilt your garden. I haven't complained about the chickens, and I've never once asked you to be anything other than what you are. So I'm asking, what are you expecting from me? Because whatever it is, either say it directly, or stop looking at me like I'm a problem you're waiting to solve itself." He opened his mouth, closed it. She waited. "I'm not expecting anything," he said finally. "That's the point." "That's not the point. That's the problem." She drove the trowel into the ground one final time and stood up. People who expect nothing from you aren't protecting themselves. They're protecting you from having to be real. She walked past him back to the house. He stood at the garden fence for a very long time, and this was the moment. Not the curtains, not the sunrises, not the grave. When Clayton Reed understood that Evelyn Marsh was not going to be someone he could keep at a comfortable distance, because she hadn't tried to tear down his wall. She had just stood on the other side of it and made entirely too much sense. I went to find Thomas that evening. Thomas was at his kitchen table with a bottle and a satisfied expression that suggested he had been waiting. "Don't," Clayton said. "Don't what I'm just sitting here. You're sitting here being smug. I'm sitting here enjoying a quiet evening." Thomas poured a second glass and pushed it across the table. "Sit down, Clayton." Clayton sat. He took the glass. He did not drink it. "She heard me," he said. Thomas said nothing. "In the barn, what I said, she heard it." Thomas picked up his glass. "How do you know?" "Because she looked at me like she knew and I deserved it." Another silence. Then Thomas said, "So what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do. You just don't want to admit it yet." Clayton looked at the glass in his hand. "She's going to leave Thomas, eventually. Everybody. If you say everybody leaves one more time," Thomas said with genuine patience, "I'm going to walk you out to the church and make you say it to the reverend so he can tell you what the actual theological term is for what you're doing to yourself." Despite everything, something in Clayton's chest shifted. Not quite a laugh, but close. "She's not Margaret," Thomas said, quieter now. "She's not trying to be. She's just herself. And yourself is sitting in that barn instead of talking to her." Clayton drank the whiskey, set down the glass. He walked home in the dark. The kitchen light was on. The curtains he had put up were just visible in the window, pale cotton lit from inside. He stood on the porch for a moment, looking at his own house. Something had changed in it, and he couldn't entirely account for the change. Only that it had something to do with a woman who argued with him about carrots and wasn't afraid of his silences and had stood at Margaret's grave and said, "She sounds like she was important," and not asked for anything more. He went inside. Evelyn was at the table with her notebook writing. She did not look up. He sat down across from her. She kept writing. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the table. Put the pitcher back. Finally, she said without looking up, "Are you going to say something, or are you just here to sit?" "I'm here to say something." She set her pen down, looked at him. "What I said in the barn," he started. "You don't need to explain it. I know what I am here. That's the thing." He met her eyes. "I don't think I said it right. I said it like it was a fact. But it was—" He stopped, started again. "I said it because I've been telling myself it's true long enough that I stopped checking whether it was." She waited. "I'm not easy to be around," he said. "I know that. And I'm not making any kind of offer. I just want you to know that when I said you'd move on, eventually, I wasn't saying I wanted you to." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn Marsh looked at this difficult, careful, grief-carrying man across the table and made a decision that she would record in her notebook later as day 23. "He's worse than I thought. Which means he's exactly what I was afraid of." She said, "Don't marry me then, Mr. Reed, but stop talking about me like I'm already gone." He stared at her. She picked up her pen. "Good night," she said, and went upstairs. He sat at the kitchen table in the curtained kitchen for a long time. Then quietly he said to the empty room, "Good night." And outside in the dark, the widow's peak stood against the stars, and the cattle were settled, and Biscuit had come back from Thomas's again, and was sleeping on the porch, and somewhere in the house, a door with a sticky hinge had been propped open to let the summer air through. The ranch was the quietest it had been in 2 years. And somehow, for the first time in 2 years, that quiet felt different, like something very carefully had begun. He didn't say anything about it the next morning. Neither did she. That was the thing about Evelyn Marsh that Clayton was still learning to account for. She didn't press. Other people, when they sensed they'd gotten somewhere with him, pushed their advantage immediately, like they were afraid the opening would close before they could get through it. Evelyn woke up, came downstairs, poured her coffee, and sat at the table with her notebook, like the previous evening had simply been an evening. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. She was writing something with the focused expression she wore when she thought no one was looking. Her pen moving fast, her lip pressed slightly inward. "What do you write in that thing?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Observations." "About what?" "Things I notice." "Like what?" She looked up, then steady and faintly amused. "Do you actually want to know, or are you making conversation because you don't know what else to do with yourself this morning?" He considered this. "Both." She closed the notebook. "I write down what I see that day, people, what they do instead of what they say. It helps me think." She picked up her coffee. "Yesterday I wrote 4 pages about a man who put up curtains and then pretended he hadn't." The corner of his jaw tightened. Not quite a smile. Close. "You should find a better subject," he said. "I'll let you know when I do," she said, and opened the notebook again. He drank his coffee standing at the counter, which he had done every morning for 2 years, and which felt this morning like a statement he was less certain of than usual. The job that broke the careful truce between them was the north pasture fence. 3 sections had come down in the night, a combination of dry rot and a calf with ambitions, and Clayton needed every hand on the repair before the herd drifted. Pete Denny and old Lou were already out. Thomas, who had no obligation but showed up anyway, showed up. Evelyn appeared at the barn in her work clothes, not a dress, but a divided skirt and a heavy canvas jacket, carrying the post-pounder. Clayton looked at her. "You don't need to come." "You need 5 people for this length of fence in one morning," she said. "You have 4. You don't know how to set fence posts. Then teach me." She shifted the post-pounder to her other hand. "Or don't and take longer. Up to you." He took longer than he should have deciding. Thomas, who was pretending to tighten a cinch nearby, made a sound that was not quite a cough. "Fine," Clayton said. "Don't argue with me about the spacing." "I won't argue with you about the spacing," she said, and walked out ahead of him. She argued with him twice about the spacing. The first time he was right, and she knew it, and conceded without drama. The second time she was right, and he knew it, and conceded by simply doing it her way without saying a word, which was, she was learning how Clayton Reed admitted he was wrong. He just did the right thing quietly and without ceremony. Old Lou watched this exchange from 20 feet away, and then looked at Thomas with the expression of a man watching a very slow horse race. "How long?" Lou asked quietly. Thomas didn't even pretend not to know what he meant. "End of summer," he said. "Maybe sooner if she keeps being right about things." By noon the fence was up. They ate lunch on the tailgate. Walt's biscuits carried out in a cloth plus the remnants of morning coffee in a tin that had given up pretending to be warm. Evelyn sat at the end of the tailgate with a cut on her left palm from a wire end she'd caught wrong. She was pressing her bandana against it with the matter-of-fact patience of someone who had decided not to make it a thing. Clayton noticed it. He walked over, took her hand without asking, looked at the cut and said, "Deep." "No, just stings." He let go of her hand, went to his saddlebag, came back with a strip of linen he used for the horses and wrapped it around her palm with a precision that suggested he had done this kind of thing many times on others, never on himself. "You should have said something," he said. "It's a scratch." "It's a cut. Say something next time." She looked at the wrapped hand, then at him. "You just spent 10 minutes wrapping a scratch." I spent 2 minutes. You counted the wire spacings on a fence I helped build. The least I can do is let you wrap my hand." He stood up. That's different." "It's exactly the same," she said, and the firmness in her voice was gentle, which was somehow harder for him to argue with than if she'd been sharp. "People can take care of each other, Clayton. That's not weakness." He walked back to the other end of the tailgate and ate his biscuit like the conversation had not happened. But Pete, who had heard all of it, leaned over to Denny and said very quietly, "End of summer." Denny looked confused. Pete waved it off. The afternoon brought something neither of them expected. Evelyn rode into Harlan Creek alone on this gray mare. Clayton had said she could use with a purpose she had not announced and a plan she had been developing quietly for 2 weeks, The Harlan Creek schoolhouse had been without a teacher since March, when Miss Fowler had married a rancher from Billings and moved on. The Reverend, a lean, practical man named Grady, who ran the church and the school board, both with the efficiency of a man who had too much to do, had been conducting lessons himself 3 mornings a week, which satisfied no one, least of all Reverend Grady. Evelyn had heard about this from Sarah Miller on her 3rd day in town. She tied the mare at the post in front of the church and went inside and found Reverend Grady at his desk in the back room, doing arithmetic with the expression of a man who had been doing arithmetic for 6 hours. "Reverend Grady," she said, "I understand you need a teacher." He looked up. "You're the woman renting from Clayton Reed." "Evelyn Marsh. I have 5 years of teaching experience in Philadelphia, and I can start Monday if your board approves it." He looked at her for a long moment. "The pay is $12 a month." "That's fine. And it's a 1-room schoolhouse with 22 students ranging from 6 to 15. I've had 31. He put down his pencil. "Can you do Monday through Friday, 7 to noon? "Yes." "Do you need the board to vote, or will you take my word that they'll vote yes if I tell them to?" "Your word is fine." He stood up and put out his hand. "Monday, Miss Marsh." She shook it. Monday. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon sun, feeling something she recognized after a moment as herself. Not the Philadelphia version with its careful social arrangements and its constant awareness of what was expected, but herself, the one who made decisions and lived by them. She had not told Clayton, not because she intended to hide it, but because she had not wanted the decision to be his. It was hers, and it was made. She told him that evening after supper. He went still. "You took a job," he said. "Yes." "In town?" "At the schoolhouse, Monday through Friday mornings." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Around and around. "You planning to tell me what your long-term plan is?" he asked, and his voice was level in that particular way that meant he was making an effort. "I'm planning to stay through the fall," she said. "The teaching income covers my room and board, and a bit besides. I thought that was useful for both of us." "I didn't ask you to make financial arrangements." "No," she said. "But you need the income, and this solves 2 problems at once, so I made the arrangement." She looked at him steadily. "That bothers you." "It doesn't bother me." "Your jaw says otherwise." "My jaw is minding its own business. Clayton." She put her hands flat on the table. "I made a decision about my own life. I didn't ask your permission because it wasn't yours to give. I'm telling you now because I live here, and you deserve to know my plans. That's different from asking permission." He looked at her across the table for a long moment. "You're going to do whatever you decide to do," he said, "regardless of what I say." "Yes." "Then why are you telling me?" She met his eyes without flinching. "Because I'm not you. I don't think being private is the same thing as being strong." The silence stretched. He looked away first. Not in defeat, in something closer to recognition, like a man hearing something in a language he doesn't speak and understanding it anyway. "Monday's laundry day," he said finally. "I'll do it Sunday." He nodded, picked up his cup, drank his coffee. $12 is low," he said after a moment. "I know. I'll work on that later." Something shifted in his expression that she was learning to read a brief lowering of whatever he kept raised. He set down the cup. "You're going to fix that too," he said. Not a question. "Probably," she said. And this time, it was close enough to a smile that she saw it. Just barely. But it was there. Monday came and Tuesday after that, and the week arranged itself around the schoolhouse in the mornings and the ranch in the afternoons. And Clayton learned without being told to leave the kitchen warm and the coffee made until 9, which was when Evelyn rode back in from town. He did not tell anyone he was doing this. He told himself it was practical. The fire needed banking anyway. The coffee was going to be made for himself regardless. Thomas came by on Wednesday, found the situation and said nothing, which was its own kind of comment. The students, for their part, had opinions about the new teacher within 3 days. Denny, who had a younger sister in the school, reported back to the ranch that Miss Marsh had made the oldest boy in the class apologize to the youngest girl for making her cry, and that she had done it not by scolding him, but by asking him in front of everyone to imagine it had been his younger sister instead. The boy had gone red and apologized, and apparently meant it. "She do that kind of thing a lot?" Clayton asked, not looking up from what he was doing. "According to my sister," Denny said, "she does it all the time. She says Miss Marsh has a way of asking questions that makes you feel like you already knew the right answer and just needed someone to ask." Clayton thought about that. "Good teacher," he said. "Best they've had," Denny said. The first real fight happened on a Friday over nothing that mattered and everything that did. Evelyn came back from town to find Clayton in the middle of repairing the chicken coop in a way that was going to make it structurally sound and completely impossible to access without a ladder. She looked at it, looked at him, and said, "You're going to make it harder to collect eggs." "I'm making it predator-proof," he said. "From what eagles?" "There was a fox last week." "One fox, and you're rebuilding the coop 3 feet higher." "I'm raising the wire, not the coop." "You're raising the access latch to above my shoulder." He looked at the latch, then at her. "You're taller than that." "Barely. And the hens aren't going to cooperate with a ladder." "The hens don't cooperate with anything." "Clayton." "Evelyn." She looked at him with her arms crossed, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who was not going to back down. And Pete, who was watching from the fence, later told Thomas that what happened next had made his entire week. Because Evelyn Marsh looked at the latch, looked at Clayton, and said, "Fine. But when I need to collect eggs at 5 in the morning in the dark, I'm waking you up to hold the ladder." "You won't," he said. "Try me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved the latch down 6 inches and did not say anything about it. She said, "Thank you," like she'd expected exactly that. He said, "Don't thank me. I'm doing it for the hens." She said, "Of course you are." And Pete had to turn around and look at the sky for a minute so Clayton wouldn't see him grinning. It was Sarah Miller who put the match to something that had been building for weeks. Sarah came by the ranch on a Saturday, ostensibly to drop off a pattern she'd promised Evelyn, actually to observe the situation directly, which was her right as the person who had set the whole thing in motion. She found Clayton in the barn and Evelyn on the porch, and she stood between the 2 points like she was taking a measurement. She sat with Evelyn on the porch steps and said without preamble, "He watches the lane for you when you ride in from town." Evelyn kept her eyes on the yard. "He probably watches for everyone." "He definitely doesn't watch for everyone. I've known Clayton Reed for 9 years. He barely watches for me, and I bring him pie." Sarah folded her hands in her lap. "He put up curtains, Evelyn." "I know." "In 2 years he hadn't touched that house. 2 weeks after you arrived, curtains." Evelyn was quiet. "I'm not telling you what to do," Sarah said. "Lord knows that man needs to get there in his own time. I'm just telling you what I see." She looked sideways at Evelyn. "And I'm asking how you see it." A long pause. "I see a man," Evelyn said carefully, "who is very good at keeping people at just enough distance that he never has to find out if they'd stay." She set her coffee cup down on the step. "And I'm trying to figure out whether I have the patience for that." Sarah looked at her with something that was not quite sympathy, more like recognition. "Do you?" Evelyn thought about the curtains, the wrapped hand, the coffee that was always warm when she came in from town, the way he had moved the latch down 6 inches and attributed it to the hens. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I'm still here." Sarah nodded, like that was the answer she had come for. The twist that broke everything open came on a Wednesday evening, and it came as most things that broke things open did, from Thomas Bell. Thomas had been in town. He had stopped at the general store. He had run into 3 people, including Reverend Grady and a cattleman named Walt Briggs, and in the course of these conversations, he had, without thinking, or perhaps thinking too slowly, mentioned that Clayton's new boarder was working out well, that she'd taken the teaching job, that she seemed like she intended to stay through fall. And then, without thinking at all, he had said, "Of course Clayton says she's just a boarder, nothing more. You know how he is." He had said it to defend Clayton, to head off speculation, to close down the town's considerable interest in Clayton Reed's domestic arrangements before it turned into the kind of talk that embarrassed everyone. He had not thought about who else might be in the general store. Agnes Sutter, who was Harlan Creek's most reliable mechanism for information distribution, had been standing 6 feet away. By Thursday noon, it had reached the schoolhouse in the form of one of Evelyn's older students, asking with the cheerful cruelty of a 13-year-old whether it was true that she was just renting a room, and did she think she'd find somewhere permanent soon. Evelyn had answered the question calmly, finished the lesson, dismissed the class, and ridden back to the ranch without stopping at Sarah's or speaking to anyone. She came in through the back door. She went to the kitchen. She put water on for coffee she didn't want and stood at the counter with her back to the room until she heard Clayton's step in the doorway. "You're back early," he said. She turned around. He saw her face and went still. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing." She poured the water even though it wasn't boiling yet. "I had a question from a student today about whether I planned to stay or move on. She'd heard something in town." A beat. She watched his face. "She'd heard that you described me as just a boarder," she said, quiet and level. "Nothing more." He went very still. "Thomas told someone," she said. "I'm not angry at Thomas. He wasn't being unkind. He was repeating what you said." She set down the pot. "So I need to know, is that what I am to you after 6 weeks? After the fence and the garden and the curtains and 5 o'clock mornings and everything we've said to each other? Am I just a boarder to you?" "Evelyn." "Don't explain it to me," she said. "Don't manage it. Just answer the question." He stood in the doorway, and she could see him fighting with himself, the old reflex against it, the trained habit of saying less, of maintaining the distance that kept things safe. "No," he said. The word came out rough like it cost him. "You're not just a boarder." "Then why did you say it?" "Because saying anything else out loud makes it real, and real things can be lost." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like exactly what Thomas told me you were doing," she said. "Protecting yourself at my expense." He had nothing to say to that because it was true, and he knew it was true, and she could see him knowing it. "I'm not Margaret," she said, and her voice was quiet enough that it was not an attack. "And I'm not going to die on you to prove a point. But I can't." She stopped. Started again. "I won't be someone you talk about in the third person like I'm a transaction. Either I'm a person in this house or I'm not. And you need to decide that, Clayton, not me." She picked up the pot and put it back on the stove. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry." She turned slowly. "I said it to close down the talk," he said. "But I said it because it was easier than admitting what I don't know how to admit." He moved to the table, sat down, put his hat on the wood and looked at it. "I don't know how to do this. I know how to work a ranch. I know how to keep people fed and the fences up and the cattle moving. I don't know how to—" He stopped, tried again. "Margaret got sick inside of 2 years. I watched it happen, and I couldn't stop it. And I built everything after that around making sure I'd never have to watch anything again." "I know," she said. "I know you know. That's—" He looked up at her. "That's the problem. You understand things without me having to say them. And I haven't had that. I don't know what to do with it." The kitchen was completely quiet. Evelyn looked at this man, difficult, careful, not unkind, and she felt something clarify inside her. Not certainty. She wasn't built for certainty, or not for the reckless kind, but something that was adjacent to it. She sat down across from him. "I came out here," she said, "because a man I thought I was going to marry chose someone else, my cousin, because her family had more standing. And I stood in his mother's parlor, and I thought I have been making myself smaller for this person for 3 years, and it did not save me from a single thing." She looked at her hands. "So I left, and I ended up here. And I don't know what I'm doing any more than you do. But I know I'm not making myself smaller again for anyone." He looked at her across the table. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I know. That's why I'm still sitting here." Another long quiet. The stove ticked. Biscuit scratched at the back door and let himself in and went directly under the table and lay down on both their feet simultaneously, which was a logistical achievement for a dog his size. Clayton looked down at the dog. Something in his face shifted not into a smile exactly, but into something without the armor in it. "Biscuit," he said, "you have no dignity." "He has excellent timing," Evelyn said. "That's not timing. He does that to everyone." "It worked, didn't it?" He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes. I'm not going to be easy. I know. I'm probably going to do something stupid again." "Probably," she agreed. "So will I." He was quiet. "Don't marry me," he said, and it came out somewhere between a warning and something else entirely. Something rawer. "I'm serious. I don't have it in me to promise you easy." She looked at him steadily across the table, across the dog, across everything that had happened in 6 weeks, and everything that hadn't been said yet. "Clayton Reed," she said. "I've been here 6 weeks, and I've fixed your garden set, your fence, taught your neighbor's children, and argued with you about chicken coop latches. I am not here for easy." He stared at her. "Too late, by the way," she said, and picked up her coffee. "I already like you, so you should probably figure out what to do with that." He opened his mouth, closed it. She drank her coffee. He picked up his hat from the table, turned it once in his hands, and set it back down. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "You do that," she said. Biscuit sighed deeply from under the table, exactly like a man who had been watching this for weeks and was relieved it had finally arrived somewhere. What neither of them knew, what was already moving toward them from the east on the twice-weekly stage carrying a letter and a claim, and a grief that had cured itself into something much harder, was that the past had a way of finding people who had tried to leave it behind. And it had found Harlan Creek. A woman had bought a ticket in Helena. She had asked the stage driver if he knew a ranch belonging to a man named Clayton Reed. The driver said he did. She had nodded and sat back against the seat, and looked out the window at the passing land with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite anger. It was the particular expression of someone who had waited a long time for something she believed was owed to her. And now she was almost there. The stage arrived on a Thursday morning, and Diane Holt stepped off it into the dust of Harlan Creek, like a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times and was finally ready to perform it. She was 31, with Margaret's coloring. The same dark hair, the same particular way of holding her chin, and Clayton, who was at the hardware store across the street, when the stage pulled in, saw her from 20 feet away and felt the blood leave his face. It was not Margaret. He knew that in the first half-second, the way the mind corrects itself. But it was close enough that his hand tightened on the post he was standing beside, and he did not move for a moment. Diane saw him at the same time. She crossed the street without hesitation. "Clayton," she said. "Diane." His voice came out even. He had not seen her in 2 years, since the funeral, since he had stood at a grave in Helena, and she had stood across from him, and they had said the necessary things and gone their separate ways, and he had assumed that was the end of something. "I wrote to you," she said. "I got the letter." "You didn't answer." "No." He released the post. "I didn't." She looked at him with Margaret's eyes, which was unfair in a way that he could not say out loud. "I need to talk to you, Clayton, about the ranch." "What about it?" "Not here." She glanced at the people on the street who were already looking. "Somewhere private." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "There's a table at Sarah Miller's store. Come on." Evelyn was at the schoolhouse when it happened. She did not know about any of it until she rode back in at noon and found the yard quieter than usual, and Pete waiting by the fence with the expression of a man who had been asked to deliver news and was trying to figure out how to do it. "Who came?" she asked. Pete blinked. "How did you—" "You're standing at the fence in the middle of the day, looking like someone put a rock in your boot." "Who came?" He told her. She listened without interrupting. Then she dismounted, handed him the reins, and said, "Where is he now?" "Barn, I think. He came back about an hour ago." She went to the barn. Clayton was working on a saddle that did not need working on, which was something she had learned. He did when he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to think about. She sat down on a hay bale without being invited and waited. He kept working. Her name is Diane Holt, he said finally without looking up. She's Margaret's younger sister. We were never close. She was 15 when Margaret and I married. We saw her at Christmas sometimes, at the funeral. What does she want? He set down the leather. She says the ranch belongs to her family. That Margaret's father had an agreement with mine before my father died before I was old enough to understand what I was inheriting. She says there's a document. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. What kind of document? A letter. She says my father promised her father that if Margaret and I had no children, the property would revert to Margaret's family, not to me. He picked the leather back up, then put it down again. She showed me a copy. I don't know if it's real. I've never seen it before. Where's the original? She says it's with her father's estate papers, in Helena. Evelyn thought carefully. Do you have your father's papers? His will, the deed. Anything from when he transferred the property to you. In the house, box under my bed. Then we start there. She stood up. He looked at her. Evelyn. Get the box, Clayton. He got the box. They spread everything on the kitchen table. The deed, his father's will, letters, land, survey papers from 1871 and 1879. And Evelyn went through it with the systematic patience of a woman who had spent 5 years teaching children that you did not skip steps. Clayton sat across from her and watched her read. Do you have a lawyer? She asked. There's Henry Alcott in town. He did the deed transfer when my father died. We need to see him. She held up a paper. This is your deed, recorded in 1880 after your father's death, your name only. No conditions, no reversionary clauses. She turned it toward him. If your father made a promise to her father, it was verbal. It's not in here. A letter could still be considered, a letter from a dead man about a promise made before a marriage that produced no children. She set the paper down. That's a legal argument, but it needs a lawyer to look at it, and we need to see the original document she's talking about, not her copy. He looked at the papers on the table. She's not lying, he said quietly. She believes it. I could see that. I believe that she believes it, Evelyn said. That doesn't make the claim valid. I was quiet. Then, my father might have said it. He and Robert Holt were close before Robert's health went. It's the kind of thing he might have said informally, and Robert might have written down, and Diane might have grown up believing was a promise. Or someone convinced her it was. He looked up. She said she has an attorney, Evelyn said carefully. In Helena. Someone advising her. Who? She didn't say. You need to find out. He looked at her across the table at this woman who had arrived with a trunk and $40 and a broken engagement, and had somehow in 7 weeks become the person he told things to without meaning to. Why are you doing this? He asked. Which part? Any of it. This isn't your problem. She looked at him for a long moment. Clayton, I fixed your garden because it was dying. I'm doing this for the same reason. He opened his mouth. She held up a hand. Don't say anything noble about it, she said. Just let me help. He closed his mouth. Thank you, she said, and pulled the deed survey toward her again. Thomas Bell arrived 20 minutes later because Thomas Bell had a sense for when things were happening that Clayton had long since stopped trying to explain. He took in the papers on the table, the two of them on either side of it, and said, I already heard. Is it real? We don't know yet, Evelyn said. I saw her at the store. Thomas pulled out a chair. She's staying at the boarding house on Mill Street, and the man she came with. Both Clayton and Evelyn looked up. She didn't come alone, Clayton said. Came with a fellow named Garrett, Gerald Garrett. Not from here, I asked around. He's a land attorney out of Helena, has an office on the main commercial block up there. Thomas sat down. He's been buying up disputed ranch properties for 3 years. There were 2 cases up in Gallatin County last year, both settled out of court. Both ranchers ended up selling for less than market because the legal fight cost more than the land was worth. Silence fell across the table. Evelyn said quietly, There it is. Clayton looked at Thomas. You're saying she's being used. I'm saying someone found a grieving young woman with a document she believed in and pointed her at a property worth twice what she probably knows. Thomas put his hands flat on the table. The question is whether Diane Holt understands that. Clayton went to see Diane that evening alone. He had asked Evelyn to stay. She had not liked it, he could see that plainly, but she had stayed. Not because he asked. Because she understood in the way she understood most things that this particular conversation had to happen without witnesses. Diane was in the small front room of the boarding house, and when Clayton came in, she was sitting upright in her chair, with her hands folded in her lap, the way Margaret used to sit when she was gathering herself before saying something difficult. The similarity made his chest ache. "I'm not trying to hurt you," she said before he could speak. "I know Diane. My father believed he told me before he died that your father made that promise, that it was written down, that if there were no children—" She stopped. "I have children now. 3. And the farm in Helena is struggling, and Mr. Garrett said the claim was legitimate, and that we had—" "Who found Garrett?" Clayton said. She blinked. "What? Did you go looking for an attorney, or did someone come to you?" A pause. A small one. But he saw it. "He came to the farm," she said. "He said he'd heard about my situation, that my father had mentioned it to someone in the business community before he died, and Mr. Garrett believed I had a rightful claim." Clayton leaned forward. "Diane, your father died 2 years ago, in the same week as Margaret. How long after that did Garrett find you?" She was quiet. "How long?" he said gently. 6 months, she said, very quietly. "He came 6 months after. And in the 2 years before he came," Clayton said, "did you have this conversation with anyone else? Did you pursue the claim at all?" "No. We were grieving. I know. But the moment Garrett appeared, he already knew about the letter, already knew about the alleged promise." She looked at him. Something was shifting in her face. Something was becoming uncertain. "He said he'd researched it," she said. "How does a land attorney in Helena come to research the estate papers of a dead farmer in order to find a claim against a ranch he has no connection to?" Clayton kept his voice even. "Diane, I'm not your enemy. I loved your sister. I kept her grave. I'm going to keep it until they put me in the ground beside her." He paused. "But someone pointed you at me, and I need you to think about who and why." She was very still. "If the letter is real," he said, "we'll deal with it. Get Henry Alcott involved, look at the original, figure out what my father actually meant and what's actually enforceable. That's a legal question, and we'll answer it legally." He looked at her steadily. "But if Gerald Garrett is using you, using Margaret's memory, using your father's words to take this land and sell it for profit, then you and I are on the same side of that." The room was very quiet. Then Diane said, "He told me if I didn't pursue the claim now, I'd lose the legal standing, that there was a time limit." "There is no time limit on a property dispute of this kind," Clayton said. "Alcott can tell you that. Ask him yourself." She looked at her hands. "Clayton," she said very quietly, "I came here because I missed her. I know the claim is real. I believe it's real. But I think I also came because she's here. She's on that land, and nothing of her is left anywhere else." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Come to the ranch, visit the grave, anytime you want. That was never something I'd refuse you." She looked up. "But don't let someone use your grief to take what isn't theirs," he said. He came home after dark and found Evelyn on the porch. She handed him a cup of coffee without a word. He sat on the step below her and drank it. After a while she said, "How is she?" "Confused," he said. "And I think she's starting to realize why." He told her about the conversation, about Garrett coming to the farm 6 months after the deaths, about the manufactured urgency. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I went to see Henry Alcott while you were gone." He turned to look at her. "You said you'd stay." "I stayed off the ranch. Alcott's office is in town. I asked him about Gerald Garrett." She held up a hand. "I know. I'll accept the lecture later." Alcott knows the name. Garrett lost his law license in Wyoming 2 years ago for fraudulent land claims. He's been operating in Montana under a different arrangement, a silent partnership with a property company in Billings. Clayton stared at her. The company has been buying ranches in this part of the territory for 18 months, she said. 4 properties, all disputes, all settled out of court, all sold within a year of acquisition at prices 2 to 3 times what the original owners received. How did Alcott know all this? He didn't, some of it. I spent an hour filling in the rest from the Helena Gazette archives he keeps. She looked at him steadily. Clayton Garrett came to Harlan Creek before Diane did, 2 weeks before. Alcott saw him at the land office. He was looking at your deed record. The silence that followed was the kind that changed the shape of things. He found the letter, Clayton said slowly. Or he found the family, found the possible claim, and then went and found the person who could make it, and gave her a story that mixed just enough truth, the real grief, the real relationship, possibly a real letter with enough manufactured urgency to move her before she could think it through. Evelyn put down her coffee. The letter might be real. Your father might have said something. It doesn't matter because even if it is, Garrett's plan was never to win in court. It was to make the fight expensive enough that you'd rather sell. He looked at her across the dark. What would they get for it? He said. Alcott estimated around $8,000, the land plus the water rights. There's talk of a railroad route through this part of the valley in the next few years. She paused. This ranch sits exactly on that route. He was very still. This was never about Margaret, he said. No, she said. It wasn't. He stood up. He walked to the edge of the porch. He put his hands on the rail and looked out at the dark land, the land his father had worked. The land he had worked, the land where Margaret was buried in the back corner by the fence line, and he was quiet for a long time. I need to talk to Diane again, he said. Yes. And we need the original letter. Yes. And we need Alcott at a public meeting before Garrett can file anything official. Reverend Grady will host it, she said. I already asked him. He turned around slowly. She was watching him with that steady, clear look she wore when she had done something she knew he might have feelings about and had decided those feelings were worth it. When did you ask Grady? This afternoon, before Alcott. I thought if we needed a public forum, better to have one arranged than to scramble. Evelyn. I know. I told you. You told me to stay on the ranch. I stayed on the ranch until you left, and then I went to town, and I did what needed doing. She met his eyes without flinching. You can be angry at me for it later. Right now, it's what we needed. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm not angry, he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, which meant they were true. He stopped. You're not used to someone doing things for you, she said. No, get used to it. She stood up. We have 3 days before Garrett tries to file. Alcott thinks he'll move by Monday. That gives us the weekend to get Diane to look at this clearly and get the original letter into Alcott's hands. She picked up her coffee cup and his. Are you with me? He looked at her standing there in the dark. This woman who had come here with $40 and a broken heart, and had somehow become the most useful, most infuriating, most... He stopped himself from the word that was trying to arrive. Not yet. Later. What do you need me to do? He said. Talk to Diane tomorrow morning, alone. Tell her what we found. Let her decide. She moved to the door. And Clayton, be kind with it. She came here because she missed her sister. That part was real. I know, he said quietly. She paused in the doorway. She would have liked you, she said. Not Margaret, she didn't say the name, but it was clear who she meant. For the record. He didn't answer. But something crossed his face, something that was not grief, or not only grief, something that was trying to be something else. She went inside. He stood on the porch until the light in the east room window went out, and then stood a while longer, listening to the land that someone had decided was worth taking. Saturday morning. Clayton was at the boarding house before 8. Diane met him in the front room. She had the look of someone who had not slept and had been thinking hard. He told her everything. Alcott's information, Garrett's history, the disbarment in Wyoming, the property company in Billings, the railroad route. She sat very still through all of it. When he finished, she said, "He told me I was doing the right thing. He made sure you believed that. He found me. I didn't look for him. I know. He knew about the letter. He knew my father's name. He knew." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "He knew things about our family I hadn't told anyone. I thought that meant he'd researched it honestly." "Or he'd done this before," Clayton said, "and he was very good at finding the details that made it feel legitimate." A long silence. Then Diane said, "The letter is real. I want you to know that. My father wrote it down because he trusted a handshake wasn't enough. But he never meant for it to be used this way. He and your father were friends." Her voice steadied. "He would be angry if he knew how this was being used." "I know," Clayton said. "That's why we need the original, not a copy Garrett made. The original, so Alcott can see exactly what it says and what it means legally." He looked at her. "Will you get it?" She was quiet. "I have 3 children," she said, "and a farm that's struggling, and a man who told me I had $8,000 coming to me." She looked up. "That's not nothing, Clayton. That was real to me." "I know. I'm not a greedy person. I want you to know that. I know that too. I thought it was ours. I thought my father had been cheated." "Your father was never cheated," he said quietly. "He and mine were friends. Whatever your father wrote down, it was grief talking. It was 2 old men making a promise about something that hadn't happened and wasn't going to. It wasn't a legal document. It was a letter." She looked at her hands. "I'll get you the letter," she said. "I'll wire to Helena today and have it sent." She raised her eyes. "What happens to Mr. Garrett?" "That," Clayton said, "is what Monday is for." Monday came in fast. The town meeting at Reverend Grady's church held 42 people, nearly every adult in Harlan Creek, plus 3 ranchers from the outlying properties who had heard something was happening and driven in. Sarah Miller was in the 3rd row. Pete and Thomas were against the back wall. Old Lou had come despite his hip and was sitting in the corner chair that Grady had put there specifically for him. Garrett was in the front row beside a man Clayton didn't know with papers on his knee and the settled expression of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. Evelyn was not sitting. She was standing against the side wall with a leather satchel over her shoulder and the particular stillness she wore when she was about to do something decisive. Reverend Grady opened the meeting. He gave the floor to Garrett. Garrett stood. He was smooth and practiced, and he laid out the claim with the confidence of a man who had never had a room turn on him. The letter, the promise, the legal standing, the timeline. When he finished, he looked at Clayton and said, "Mr. Reed, I think we both know what the fair resolution is here." "Do we?" Clayton said. Garrett spread his hands. "The property reverts to the Holt family. A sale can be arranged that compensates you for your improvements. It's a clean resolution." "To whom?" Evelyn said. Garrett looked at her. "I'm sorry. You said a sale can be arranged." She pushed off the wall and walked forward, opening the satchel. "A sale to whom, Mr. Garrett?" "Because the Holt family." She nodded toward Diane, who was in the 2nd row. "Has told us they have no intention of selling. So who exactly is waiting to buy this property?" A ripple through the room. "The Holt family's intentions are Miss Marsh." Garrett's voice sharpened. "Evelyn Marsh. I teach at the schoolhouse." She placed a paper on the table in front of Reverend Grady. "This is a record of 4 property transactions in Montana Territory over the past 18 months. All 4 involved disputed claims. All 4 were resolved with out-of-court settlements. All 4 properties were subsequently sold to a company called the Yellowstone Valley Property Trust, registered in Billings." She placed a second paper beside the first. "This is the list of principals of that trust filed with the Territorial Registrar last January. The managing partner is a silent investor operating through a law firm in Helena." She placed a third paper on top. "This is the record of Gerald Garrett's disbarment in Wyoming Territory in 1885 for fraudulent claims against landowners. He has since relocated to Montana, where he is operating as a land consultant rather than a licensed attorney." The room had gone completely still. Garrett stood up. "Those documents are certified copies from the registrar's office," Evelyn said. "Reverend Grady, you'll see the seal on each page." Grady looked. He nodded slowly. "Mr. Garrett," Evelyn said, turning to face him directly, "you approached Diane Holt 6 months after her father's death. You presented yourself as having researched her family's claim independently. But you had visited this town 2 weeks before you went to Helena. You had already reviewed the deed records at the land office." She let that sit for a moment. "You found the claim, and then you found the person you could use to make it." Garrett looked at the room. For the first time, it was not looking back at him with the polite attention of people who were going to let this go the way he needed it to. Sarah Miller was leaning forward with her arms crossed. Thomas had straightened off the wall. Pete had his hat in his hand and was watching Garrett with the particular stillness of a man deciding something. Even old Lou had his eyes fixed on the front of the room with an expression that suggested his hip was not the thing bothering him most today. "I think," Reverend Grady said quietly, but with the particular weight of a man who had been running this community for 12 years, "that we would benefit from hearing from Henry Alcott." Alcott stood from his seat in the second row. Garrett sat down. He sat down slowly, like a man whose legs had just stopped being completely reliable, and he looked at the papers on the table in front of Grady, and then he looked at Evelyn, and then he looked around the room at 42 people who were looking back at him, and something in his face went through a sequence. Confidence, then calculation, then the first crack of something underneath. He looked finally at Clayton. Clayton was standing against the far wall with his arms at his sides and his hat in his hand, and he looked at Garrett with the same expression he probably gave fence posts that weren't doing their job. Not angry, not triumphant. Just clear. Just certain. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Alcott spoke for 11 minutes. He laid it out the way a careful man lays bricks one at a time, each one, level, nothing leaning. The deed. The will. The absence of any reversionary clause. The legal standing of a personal letter versus a recorded document. The territorial precedent on verbal promises made between private parties with no witness and no notarization. When he finished, he set his papers down and looked at Reverend Grady and said, "There is no enforceable claim against this property. There never was." The room exhaled. Garrett did not stand up again. He sat in the front row with his papers on his knee and his jaw set, and he looked at the floor and the man beside him. The one Clayton hadn't recognized leaned over and said something very quietly, and Garrett gave a single short nod. Reverend Grady looked at Garrett over his glasses. "Mr. Garrett, do you have a response to Mr. Alcott's assessment?" Garrett looked up. For a moment something crossed his face. The calculation of a man weighing which version of a retreat costs him least. "The claim," he said carefully, "was brought in good faith on behalf of the Holt family based on documentation in their possession. If Mr. Alcott's reading of territorial law is correct," a pause precisely waited, "then the matter is closed." "The matter," said Reverend Grady, "is considerably more than closed." He said it quietly. But the room heard it. And the room 42 people who had lived in this valley their whole lives, who knew what their land meant and what it cost to hold it. The room shifted in a way that was not loud, but was absolute. Sarah Miller said from the third row, "Reverend, I think we'd all like to know what Mr. Garrett intends to do next, given that he has apparently done this before in Gallatin County and the time before that." "I'm not obligated to." "No," said Thomas Bell from the back wall. "You're not obligated to say a word, but I'd like the name of the property company in Billings, the Yellowstone Valley Trust, the one you sell to." He pushed off the wall. "I'd like to know if any of the ranchers from those 4 properties are still in the territory and whether they know what their land sold for after you arranged the settlement." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Because if they don't," Thomas said conversationally, "I think they'd find it interesting." Garrett looked at the man beside him again. The man stood up, collected his hat, and walked toward the door without ceremony. After a moment, Garrett stood and followed. He did not say anything on the way out. He did not look at Clayton. But he had to walk the length of the room to reach the door, and the room watched him do it. Every face turned. Nobody speaking. Nobody looking away. And it was the kind of silence that a man carries with him a long way afterward. Howe was at the door when Evelyn said clearly and without heat, "The Territorial Land Office in Helena has already received a copy of those documents, Mr. Garrett, along with a letter from Mr. Alcott. I sent it Friday." He stopped, just for a moment. Then he went out, and the door closed behind him. Pete against the back wall let out a breath that was almost a word. Old Lou in the corner chair looked at no one in particular and said, "Well," which was about as much as he said about anything, but it covered it. Diane was still in her seat in the second row. She had not moved through any of it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes down, and when the room began to stir around her, people standing talking the particular energy of a community that has just collectively done something, she stayed still. Clayton walked over and crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "Diane." She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but her hands were pressed so hard together that her knuckles were pale. "I'm sorry," she said. "I believed him. I believed all of it. I know. I almost—" She stopped. "If you hadn't come to see me, if that woman of yours hadn't found those papers, I would have let him—" She pressed her lips together. "My father would have been mortified." "Your father trusted people," Clayton said. "That's not a flaw." She looked at him. "What do I do now?" "Nothing. Go home to your children. The farm in Helena, what does it actually need? A new roof on the east barn, a working pump on the south well." She almost smiled, but it was a thin thing. "Nothing as dramatic as a lawsuit. I know a man who does good work. I'll send you his name." He stood up. "And Diane, come back, when you want. Not for the claim just to come. She'd want that." Diane stood. She was a full head shorter than him, and she looked up at him with Margaret's eyes and said, "She would have liked Evelyn." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." Outside the community of Harlan Creek did what communities do after something significant has been held off. They stood around in the late morning air and talked and reassured each other and gradually let the relief come through. Sarah Miller was already telling Walt Briggs that she had known something was wrong with Garrett from the moment she saw him, which was not entirely true, but was not entirely false either. And Reverend Grady was shaking hands with Alcott, and Denny had appeared from somewhere to congratulate Pete on a thing Pete had not technically done, but accepted graciously. Thomas found Clayton at the edge of the yard. "Well," Thomas said. "Don't," Clayton said. "I'm just standing here." "You're standing here being smug again." "I am a little smug," Thomas admitted. "That woman of yours sent documents to the land office on Friday, before the meeting, before she even knew if you'd agree to the meeting." He shook his head. "Clayton, that woman sent evidence to Helena before you'd finished deciding to fight." Clayton looked across the yard to where Evelyn was talking to Reverend Grady. She had her satchel over one shoulder, and she was saying something that was making Grady nod slowly. She had the look she wore when she was solving a problem, clear-eyed, focused, slightly ahead of whoever she was talking to. "I know," Clayton said. "You know what you need to do," Thomas said. "Thomas, I'm just saying. I heard you. She fixed your garden, Clayton. She fixed your fence. She fixed your reputation in front of 40 people. Thomas paused. "What exactly are you waiting for?" Clayton didn't answer, but he watched her across the yard for a long moment, and whatever was happening in his face was not the careful, closed expression he had worn for 2 years. It was something else. Something that had been building since curtains and sunrise coffee and a grave in the back corner of the property, and it had arrived somewhere definite, and he was the last person in Harlan Creek to say so out loud. They rode home, mostly in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, the kind that had become their particular language, the one that didn't need filling. Biscuit was waiting on the porch. Pete and Denny and Lou were back at their work. The ranch smelled like grass and fence-cut wood, and the faint sweetness of whatever Walt was cooking, and it was ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when you have just fought to keep them. Evelyn put the mare up herself. Clayton unsaddled his horse. They moved around the barn in the practiced rhythm they had developed over 2 months without ever deciding to develop it, knowing where the other was without looking, working in the same space without collision. When they came out, she went toward the house. Evelyn. She stopped, turned. I was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he didn't know how to rehearse things, and was about to say something real. "What you did," he started. "The land office, Alcott, Grady, all of it." He stopped, started again. "You did all of that for a piece of land that isn't yours and a fight that wasn't your problem." "It was my problem," she said, "because it was yours." He looked at her. "That's the thing I'm trying to tell you," he said, and his voice came out rough at the edges the way it did when he was not managing it. 2 months ago, I didn't want a boarder. I didn't want anyone in this house. I told you it wasn't going to be easy, and I told you not to expect anything, and I told Thomas you were going to leave." He paused. "I said all of that because it was the safe thing to say, because safe was all I had left." She waited. "I was wrong," he said. "Not about what I said, about what I was doing when I said it." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I was protecting myself, not you, myself, and I put that on you in a way that wasn't fair." "Clayton, I'm not done." She stopped. "You came here with $40 and a notebook, and you fixed everything you could reach," he said. "The garden, the fence, my reputation at a town meeting, my ability to have a conversation at a table like a human being." He looked up at her. "I don't know how to say the rest of this in a way that sounds like anything other than what it is. But you're the first person in 2 years who made this place feel like somewhere I was living, instead of somewhere I was waiting." The yard was very quiet. A horse shifted in the barn. Somewhere above them in the blue, a hawk was making slow circles. Evelyn stood with her satchel over her shoulder and looked at this man, difficult, careful, true, and felt the thing she had written in her notebook. 43 days ago. The thing she had marked with an asterisk and read back to herself several times since, "You are in trouble. You already know it." "I know," she said. I'm not good at this," he said. "I know that too. I make mistakes." "Yes. I'm going to say the wrong thing sometimes and do the wrong thing sometimes, and I'm probably going to stand in a barn and describe you as a boarder to someone who shouldn't have heard it." "You did that already." "I know. I'm saying I'll probably do the equivalent again, some other version of it, because I don't know how to be easy about this kind of thing." She crossed the yard. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough that he had to stop turning his hat or hit her with it. "Clayton Reed," she said. "I spent 3 years making myself smaller for a man who still chose someone else. I rode a stage for 6 weeks and ended up at a ranch with a man who warned me off on day 1 and put up curtains on day 15. She looked at him directly. "I am not here by accident. I chose this. I choose it." She paused. "Now you choose." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I choose it." Not fancy, not decorated. Just those 3 words, said the way he said things that cost him rough and certain and meant. She didn't cry. That wasn't her way. But something in her face went through a shift that was its own kind of answer. "Good," she said. "Now come inside. Walt's making something that smells like it might actually work." He looked at her. Then he did something she had not seen him do in 2 months. He laughed. Not loudly, just genuinely. A real sound unguarded from a man who had forgotten he could. She smiled. And they went inside, and the door that had always stuck in the humidity swung open like it had been waiting for permission. The week that followed was not the end of anything. It was in the way of real things, the beginning of something harder and better, the part where choosing had to be proven every ordinary day. Thomas Bell managed to restrain him for approximately 48 hours before he appeared at the ranch with the satisfied expression of a man who had been right and wanted it acknowledged. "Don't," Clayton said. "I just came to fix your north water trough," Thomas said, producing tools from absolutely nowhere. "I'm not saying a word." He didn't say a word. He said 11 things, none of which were technically words about the situation, but all of which clearly were, and Clayton bore it with the patience of a man who understood that Thomas Bell's smugness was the price of Thomas Bell's loyalty, and it was an acceptable price. Evelyn, who was on the porch and could hear all of it, wrote in her notebook, Day 66. TB vindicated. He is handling it gracefully for someone who is handling it completely ungracefully. That evening, Thomas stayed for supper, which became the first of what would be a regular arrangement. Thomas at the table on Tuesdays and Fridays, Lou on Sundays, when his hip allowed Denny occasionally, when he gathered the courage to mention his sweetheart in town, and needed the cover of company. The table that had been set for one for 2 years was set for more. Nobody made a ceremony of it. It simply became the shape of things. Diane wrote from Helena 10 days later. The letter came addressed to both of them, which Clayton noticed and which Evelyn noticed him noticing. Diane wrote that she had looked carefully at what remained of her father's papers, that she had found the original letter, that she had read it with fresh eyes without Garrett standing beside her, explaining what it meant, and she had come to understand that her father had written it in sorrow in the weeks after Margaret's diagnosis, when he was afraid for his daughter and trying to find a way to provide for her after he was gone. It was not a legal document. It was a father's letter. It was grief and love and impracticality in equal measure, and it was never meant to be a weapon. She wrote, I think my father would have liked Evelyn. I think he would have said she was exactly the kind of person worth fighting to hold on to. I think you already know that. She signed it. Your sister still, if you'll have me. Clayton read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he folded it and set it down and looked at the curtains in the window and was quiet for a while. Evelyn poured his coffee and sat across from him and did not ask. After a while he said, She called herself my sister. I noticed, Evelyn said. I haven't had family and... He stopped. I know. He looked at her across the table. You're going to write back to her. I was going to ask you first. Don't ask me first, just write. He picked up the coffee. Tell her we'll expect her at Christmas if she can manage the travel. Evelyn looked at him. What? He said. Nothing, she said, and got up to find paper, and he could hear as she moved through the kitchen something that was very close to a hum. It was Pete who brought the news that Garrett had left the territory. He'd heard it from the postmaster, who had heard it from the stage driver, who had seen Garrett at the Helena depot with luggage and the posture of a man leaving a situation behind him. The man who had accompanied him to the meeting, whose name Alcott eventually determined, was one Carl Briggs, a silent investor in the Yellowstone Valley Trust, had also left. The Territorial Land Office had opened an inquiry. It would be slow, such things always were, but Alcott was confident the record would catch up with both men eventually. 2 of the 4 families who had sold properties in the previous 18 months had been contacted. One had already spoken with a lawyer in Gallatin County about the price they'd received versus what the land later sold for. Not your problem, Evelyn said when Clayton raised this. Alcott will follow it. Let him. Those families are being helped. You can't carry everyone's fight, Clayton. I know that. Do you? She looked at him steadily. Because you look like a man who is about to find 3 more things to fix before the week's out. He was quiet. Then, there might be 2. She put her hands over her face, then took them down. Fine, she said. What are the 2? The school board is paying you $12. We've discussed this. I spoke to Grady. The board meets next week. Lou Hennessy on the board has 2 children in your school, and he told me privately that the previous teacher, the one who moved to Billings, made 15. She stared at him. You negotiated my salary with the school board without telling me. I suggested to Grady that the discussion was worth having. That's not negotiating. It is exactly negotiating. I mentioned a number. Clayton. 15 is fair. You know 15 is fair. She pressed her lips together. And the second thing. He looked at the table for a moment. When he looked up, his expression was different, quieter, and underneath it something that she was only now learning to recognize as the particular way his face looked when he was about to say something he had been carrying for a while. The East Room, he said. She waited. It faces the chicken coop, he said. Has a door that sticks, 1 window. I've managed. You've managed for 2 months. He met her eyes. I want to change that. The room arrangement. The kitchen was very quiet. "What are you suggesting?" she said carefully. "I'm suggesting," he said, "that we do it properly. That we ask Reverend Grady. That we make it—" He stopped. Tried again. "I'm not good at this kind of thing." "You're doing fine." "Evelyn." "Yes. I'm asking you to marry me." He said it flatly, directly, without decoration, which was exactly how he said the truest things. "I know I said don't. I know I said all of it. But I'm asking." She looked at him across the kitchen table, the curtained window, the morning light, the coffee between them. This man who had warned her off and put up curtains and wrapped her hand and moved the chicken coop latch 6 inches and laughed in the yard and said, "I choose it," in 3 plain words. "Yes," she said. Same tone, same directness. He exhaled. It was a sound that came from somewhere deep, like a man setting down something heavy he had been carrying without noticing. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Biscuit from under the table made a sound of profound satisfaction and did not move. It was Thomas Bell who told the rest of Harlan Creek, which was expected. It was Sarah Miller who cried, which was also expected, though she would later deny it and attribute the moisture to dust. It was Reverend Grady who said with genuine pleasure, "I had wondered when he'd get there." It was old Lou who said nothing at all, but who showed up the following morning, bad hip and all, and spent 3 hours helping Pete fix the East Room's sticky door so it worked properly without being asked, without saying a word about why. And it was Denny who finally asked his sweetheart in town if she would like to take a walk on Sunday, emboldened by the general atmosphere, and she said yes, which Pete would later call the most productive side effect of the entire Garrett affair. The night before the wedding arrived, the way those nights always do. Expected and impossible simultaneously. Clayton found himself in the kitchen at midnight, unable to sleep, not entirely sure why. He was not nervous in the ordinary sense. He was occupied. His mind kept going to the same places and finding things there. The grave in the back corner, the curtains, the fence line, the moment in the barn when he had said she'd leave and known even as he said it that he hoped he was wrong. He heard her step on the stairs before she appeared. She came into the kitchen in her robe, stopped when she saw him and said, "You too." "Couldn't settle," he said. She sat down at the table. He poured water for both of them. He sat across from her. For a while neither spoke. But it was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of 2 people who had been talking honestly long enough that silence had stopped being avoidance. Then she said, "I want to tell you something I haven't said." He looked at her. "I wasn't—" She chose the words carefully. "When I came here I wasn't in good shape. I told you about James, about what happened. But I didn't tell you how much of myself I had given away before that, slowly over 3 years. Little adjustments, smaller opinions, quieter rooms." She turned the water glass in her hands. "I came west because I needed to find out if I was still the person I thought I was before all of that." He listened without interrupting. "You never asked me to be smaller," she said. "Not once. You argued with me, and you disagreed with me, and you infuriated me on a fairly regular basis. But you never asked me to make myself less." She looked up. "That's not a small thing. I want you to know that's not a small thing to me." He was quiet for a moment. "The person who left Philadelphia," he said, "is the same one who fixed my garden." "Yes." "She's the same one who sent documents to Helena on a Friday before the meeting." "Yes." "Then whoever you were before wasn't lost," he said. "You just couldn't hear her where you were." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "That might be the most perceptive thing you've ever said." "Don't make a habit of telling me that," he said. "I have a reputation." She laughed. Actually laughed, the real one, not the polite one. He watched it happen, and something settled in him the way things settle when they find their right place. "Clayton," she said when she'd caught her breath. "Yeah. I know tomorrow is, I know it's a lot. For you. Given everything." He understood what she was saying. She was giving him room even now to say if it was too much. That was who she was. She made space for honesty even when it might have cost her. "It's not too much," he said. "It's the right kind of a lot." He paused. She was someone I loved. She'll always be someone I loved. That doesn't go away. He met her eyes. But I'm not doing this because I've forgotten. I'm doing it because you made me understand that holding on to grief isn't the same as honoring someone. It's just holding. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat there in the curtained kitchen in the deep of the night, holding on to nothing that needed holding, just each other in the quiet before the morning. "We should sleep," she said eventually. "Probably," he said. Neither of them moved. Clayton. "Yeah. I'm glad I got on that stage." He looked at her. "Me too," he said. "Go sleep, Evelyn." She stood, squeezed his hand once before she let go, went to the stairs. At the bottom step, she paused and said without turning, "Thank you for the curtains, that first week. I know you didn't think I noticed." He didn't answer. She went upstairs. He sat in the kitchen a while longer in the light with the curtains she had thanked him for framing the dark outside, and the feeling in his chest was not grief and not loss, and not the particular hollow waiting he had grown so used to that he'd stopped noticing it. It was the opposite of that. He put out the light and went to bed and slept for the first time in 2 years without waking once before morning. The morning of the wedding arrived the way Clayton had predicted. All important things arrived without ceremony, without announcement. Just suddenly there when you turned around. Howe was up before 4, which was not unusual. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee, which was not unusual either. But the curtains were pushed aside so he could see the sky coming in pale over the Widow's Peak, and he stood there looking at it the way he had once looked at that mountain, as though it was simply a mountain, and now looked at it differently, because everything you share with someone changes its shape slightly, and the mountain had become something Evelyn had pointed at on the first day and called beautiful, and now he could not look at it without hearing that word in her voice. Pete appeared in the yard before sunrise, which was unusual, because Pete's normal arrival was 6:30, and it was barely 5. He was carrying something bundled under his arm. Clayton went to the back door. "What are you doing here?" Pete held up the bundle. It was a length of white ribbon, the kind from Sarah Miller's store, wrapped around something that turned out to be a bunch of wildflowers that were clearly the result of a very early morning walk through the property. "Lou cut them," Pete said. "Before his hip got him. He was out there at 4:15. Clayton looked at the flowers. At Pete. Back at the flowers. "You're going to put those on the table," Clayton said. "That's the plan," Pete said, and walked past him into the kitchen like he had been invited. Clayton stood in the doorway and thought, this is what it looks like when people choose to show up. Not because they have to, because they want to. I went back inside and let Pete put the flowers on the table. Evelyn came downstairs at 6 and stopped at the kitchen doorway. The table had the flowers. The coffee was made. Pete had apparently also found a way to produce clean cloth for the table and had retreated before she came down. Visible the man gone, which was its own kind of grace. Clayton was standing at the counter. "Pete," he said by way of explanation. She looked at the flowers. They were imperfect and various, and they included at least 2 things she could not identify, and something that might have been a weed that Lou had included by mistake or on purpose. And they were the most honest bouquet she had ever seen in her life. She sat down at the table without saying anything. He sat across from her. They drank their coffee in the morning quiet. Outside, the day was building. "Ready," he said eventually. "Almost," she said. "Ask me again in 20 minutes. He gave her 20 minutes to the second, which she knew because she could feel him counting them, and then he said, "Ready now." "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Let's go get married." The church was not full in the way that a spectacle fills a room. It was full in the way a community fills a room, people who came because they meant it. Reverend Grady had not announced the ceremony to the wider county. He hadn't needed to. Harlan Creek had its own mechanisms, and by 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, the pews held Walt and Denny and Pete in a row, old Lou in the end seat with his legs stretched out, Thomas Bell in the second row, with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this since approximately the 3rd week and was not going to pretend otherwise. Sarah Miller was in the front pew. She had worn her good dress, the gray one she kept for occasions she considered worth the trouble, and she had her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, which was how she sat when she was feeling something she did not plan to show. Agnes Sutter was 3 rows back. She had come because she had heard, and she had heard because she had once been the mechanism by which Clayton's words about just a boarder had reached Evelyn's students, and she had thought about that since the town meeting, with the particular discomfort of a person who has been a small part of something unkind without intending to be. She was not going to say any of that. But she was here. Diane had wired 2 days earlier. She could not make the travel in time, the children the distance, but she had sent a letter that arrived Saturday, addressed to Evelyn, which Evelyn had read alone in the East Room, and then come downstairs with her eyes bright and said only, "She sends her love to both of us." Clayton had not asked what else the letter said. He figured Evelyn would tell him when she was ready, and if she was never ready, that was fine too. Reverend Grady stood at the front and looked at the room with the expression of a man who had performed many ceremonies and knew the difference between the ones that were obligation and the ones that were real. This one was real. He had known it since the afternoon Evelyn Marsh had walked into his office and shaken his hand and said, "Monday," like it was already decided. He had confirmed it at the town meeting, watching her lay documents on his table with the steady hands of someone who had decided what mattered and was acting accordingly. And he had been certain of it last week, when Clayton Reed had come by the church alone, no announcement, and sat down in the front pew and said, "I want to do this right, Grady. Tell me what right looks like." Grady had told him. And now here they were. Clayton stood at the front with his hat in his hand. He would not wear it inside the church. That was the line in the cleanest clothes he owned, which were not fancy, but were his best, and which Evelyn had not commented on because she understood the statement they made. She came down the aisle on no one's arm because she had not asked anyone, and because it had not occurred to her that this was unusual until Thomas had offered gently, and she had said, "Thank you, Thomas. But I've been walking myself places for 27 years. I think I can manage 12 feet. Thomas had nodded and sat back down. So she walked herself forward, which was exactly right, and Clayton watched her come and did not look at anything else. And what was on his face in that moment was something that Pete would describe to his wife later as, like a man who has been standing in a cold wind for a long time and finally came inside. She reached the front and stood across from him. He said without preamble very quietly, so only she heard, "You walked yourself." "I did," she said. "Of course you did," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Grady began. The vows, when they came, were the standard words. The words that had been said in churches and fields and parlors across 100 years of this country's life. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse. Clayton said them straight through the way he did everything he meant. No hesitation, no performance, just a man saying true things. Evelyn got to for better, for worse, and stopped. Not from uncertainty. Not from anything wrong. She stopped in the way she had described to Clayton months ago, the way she sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence to feel the weight of it. The words were old, and they were serious, and they were going to mean what they said, and she wanted to know that she knew that in the exact moment she was saying them. The room held still. Sarah Miller in the front pew pressed her hands tighter together. Thomas had stopped breathing. Clayton looked at Evelyn and read her face that particular focused stillness that he knew that he had learned the way you learn the language of someone you have paid close attention to, and he waited. He did not prompt her. He did not look around. He just waited because he understood she was not leaving, she was arriving, and you did not rush a person arriving somewhere important. She let out a slow breath, and then she finished the vow. Every word deliberate. Every word weighted and meant dropped into the silence like something being placed carefully in the right position. For better, for worse. For richer, for poorer. In sickness and in health. Until death do us part. Sarah Miller made a sound that she would later blame on the particular quality of the morning air. Old Lou at the end of his pew looked at the ceiling for a moment. Agnes Sutter, 3 rows back, pressed her lips together and thought, "I am going to be kinder. which was the exact thought she had been building towards since the town meeting, and which was in that moment complete. Reverend Grady said, "You may." "I know," Clayton said, and he was already there. The reception was held at the ranch because where else? Walt had been cooking since the previous afternoon and was deeply invested in the outcome. He had produced a quantity of food that suggested he had either invited the whole county or simply cooked until his feelings were resolved. Thomas opened a bottle of something he had been saving for an occasion worthy of it. Pete gave a toast that was 4 sentences long and ended with, "She came here to figure out what came next, and what came next was this. That seems about right." Denny, emboldened by the general atmosphere and the presence of his sweetheart from town, who had come with him for the occasion, and was sitting next to him with the careful posture of someone trying to be appropriate at their first ranch wedding, said nothing out loud, but sat through the whole afternoon with the expression of a man taking notes. Old Lou ate 2 full plates and then fell asleep in the corner chair with biscuit across his feet, which was the most comfortable either of them had looked in weeks. Sarah Miller found Evelyn in the kitchen, helping Walt carry something out that didn't need carrying, which Sarah recognized immediately as what Evelyn did when she needed a moment to stand still inside all the noise. "How are you?" Sarah said. "Good," Evelyn said. "Really good." "You should be out there." "I know, I just needed 1 minute to—" She set down the thing she was carrying. "It's a lot, the good kind, but a lot." Sarah looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I've been a widow for 10 years. My Harold died in the winter of '77. She said it simply without tragedy in her voice. "I stopped believing men could change. I thought once they built themselves into a shape that was the shape." She looked at Evelyn directly. "I was at a town meeting 2 weeks ago watching Clayton Reed stand against a back wall while you laid out evidence that saved his property, and I thought that man knows what he has. He's not standing there trying to take the credit. He's standing there watching her do what she does, and he's—" She stopped. "He's proud, just completely proud of you. And I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe some of them can." Evelyn looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for sending me to him, in the first place." Sarah made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I told him he needed the income and was too proud to admit it, which was true. But I also thought—" She straightened. "I thought a woman who could hold her own in a conversation with me might be able to hold her own with him, and I was right." "Don't tell him that," Evelyn said. "Lord, no," Sarah said. "He's still a difficult man." "Hi is," Evelyn agreed. "I like him anyway." Sarah picked up the thing Evelyn had set down and walked it out herself. Evelyn stood in the kitchen for one more moment, the kitchen with the curtains. The kitchen that had been the site of more honest conversation in 3 months than most rooms saw in a decade, and then she went back out to the people she had chosen. Clayton found her mid-afternoon standing at the fence at the back of the property. Not at the grave. At the fence, looking out at the land. But the grave was visible from where she stood, and he knew she knew that. He came and stood beside her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She didn't look away from the land. "I just wanted to see it, all of it, the whole thing." He looked with her. The valley below the Widow's Peak. The cattle moving slow on the south pasture. The fence lines they had repaired together in July. The garden she had pulled back from the dead. The house with its kitchen light already on, because Walt was still in there doing something, and the door had been open all day. "It's a good piece of land," she said. "It is," he said. "I'm going to love it," she said. "Not the future uncertain kind of going to. The declarative kind. The kind you say when you've already decided." He looked at her profile, the determined line of her chin, the particular way she stood when she was certain of something, and said, "The land's going to have a lot to live up to." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you fixed it in 3 months. The fence, the garden, the water trough Pete was ignoring. The whole thing looks better than it has in years. I fixed the obvious things." "You fixed the less obvious ones too," he said, and he did not look at her when he said it, which was how she knew he meant it. She looked back at the land. "I told Grady," she said, that I'd like to continue teaching through spring. He nodded. And I had a letter last week from a woman in Billings, a teacher there who wants to set up a curriculum exchange between the schools. I'd go twice a year, she'd come here twice a year. That's good, he said. It might mean 2 trips a year to Billings. I know what twice a year means. I just want to make sure, Evelyn. He turned to look at her. I told you in the yard 2 months ago. I choose this. That doesn't stop meaning what it means because you get a letter from Billings. She met his eyes. I know, she said. I just like hearing it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I choose it. Plain as that. No decoration. She smiled, the real one, the one that wasn't polished for company, and looked back at the valley. They stood at the fence together while the afternoon came down and the shadows grew long over the land they were both now standing on. The twist that completed itself that evening was small, and it was Thomas Bell who brought it, which was fitting. He found Clayton at the edge of the celebration with a glass in his hand and the expression of a man who was happy in the particular way that happy lands on people who have not expected it, carefully, like something that might still be taken back. Got a letter, Thomas said, from a friend in Gallatin County, about those other properties, the ones Garrett was involved with. Clayton looked at him. The Hendersons and the Dawes family, the 2 Alcott contacted. They've been in touch with a territorial advocate in Helena. The inquiry into the Yellowstone Valley Trust expanded. They found 3 more families. Thomas took a drink. Long story short, the trust is being dissolved. The properties are being examined for fraudulent acquisition. 2 of the families might get something back. Clayton was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. It'll take time, Thomas said. Legal things always do. I know. But it's moving. Thomas looked at him. You started it, when Evelyn sent those documents to Helena. She started it, Clayton said. You let her, Thomas said, which was Thomas Bell's way of giving Clayton Reed credit in a manner that Clayton Reed could actually accept. Clayton drank his drink. Thomas, he said. Yeah, thank you. He said it without looking at him, which was also how Clayton Reed thanked people when he meant it. For what you said to me, over the past 3 months, when I was being an idiot. You were being yourself, Thomas said. Which overlaps with idiot sometimes. I make the distinction. Generous. I'm a generous man. They stood side by side in the way of men who have been friends long enough that standing together is its own form of conversation. Then Thomas said, She's good, Clayton. I know. Not just for you. She's good, as a person. I know that too. You don't deserve her. I know. But, Thomas said, you're going to try to. It wasn't a question. Clayton didn't answer it like one. Every day, he said. The guests left as the sun went down. Pete walked Lou home because Lou's hip had made its opinion known about the length of the occasion. Denny left with his sweetheart in a state of quiet elation. Walt cleaned his kitchen with the satisfaction of a man who had made something that worked. Agnes Sutter on her way out stopped and said to Evelyn simply, I'm glad you stayed. Nothing else. But she meant it, and Evelyn could hear that and nodded once. Sarah was last. She put on her coat at the door and paused, hand on the frame. Clayton, she said. He looked at her. Harold would have liked you better now, she said, for what it's worth. He looked at her for a moment. High bar, he said. Harold was a good man. He was, she said. So are you. You're just slower about it. She went out, and her footsteps faded down the lane, and the night came in full. The house was quiet. Not the quiet it had been for 2 years. The held-breath quiet of a place waiting for something it couldn't name. A different quiet. The kind that has people in it even when nobody's talking. Evelyn was at the table with her notebook. She had not opened it yet. She was just holding it. Clayton sat across from her with a cup of coffee he'd stopped drinking. What are you going to write? He said. She looked at the notebook, then at him. I don't know yet. You always know. Not tonight. She set the notebook down. Tonight I think I just want to be in it, not writing it down. He looked at her across the table. That's new, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He picked up his coffee, set it back down. Outside Biscuit had taken up his position on the porch, occupying exactly the amount of space a dog could occupy if the dog had absolutely no sense of proportion. The chickens were settled. The cattle were quiet on the south pasture. The kitchen light was on the curtains pale against the dark. Clayton, she said. Yeah. I've been thinking about the East Room. The East Room is storage now. You moved out. I know. I meant... She paused. There's a school in Billings that contacted me because they need a curriculum director. Someone who travels between schools helps build teaching programs for small rural districts. She looked at him steadily. It's not twice-a-year travel. It would be 4 trips, maybe 5. 1 month of the year away from the ranch spread across the season. He was quiet. That's more than I said this afternoon, she said. It is. I know. He turned his coffee cup once, then again. Is it what you want? He said. It's what I'm good at, and it would mean other children in other small towns would have teachers who know what they're doing. She held his eyes. I want to know if it's something you can live with. He looked at her for a long moment. Can you teach Denny to manage the east pasture rotation while you're gone? He said. He's been getting it wrong all summer. She stared at him. Because if you're away 4 trips a year, I need 1 more person who knows the rotation, he said. Pete's getting older. Lou's hip is only going to go one direction. That's... She stopped. Started again. You're not going to argue with me about it. Should I? I thought you might. You told me this afternoon you were going to love this land, he said. I believe you. A month a year in Billings doesn't change what you said at the fence. He picked up the coffee. As long as Denny learns the rotation. She looked at him. He looked back. I'll teach him, she said. He'll complain. He complains about everything. He'll learn. I know. You're a good teacher. The kitchen was warm, and the night was dark, and the widow's peak stood against the stars, the way it always had, the same mountain, the same shape, but seen now from inside a life that had opened instead of closed. Evelyn Marsh. Evelyn, now though it would take her a few days to remember to write it that way, opened her notebook. She picked up her pen. She wrote day 97. He asked about the rotation. She looked at those 5 words. Then she wrote, That's how I knew. She closed the notebook. Clayton was watching her. Good, he said. Very, she said. He nodded, finished his coffee, stood up, looked at her once more in the kitchen light, this woman who had arrived with a trunk and $40, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that smaller was not an option, and he said nothing because there was nothing left that needed saying. He put the cup in the basin. She blew out the lamp. They went upstairs together, and behind them the kitchen held its quiet. The curtained window, the flowers in their jar, the notebook on the table, the chair where a dog who had no dignity would be in approximately 4 minutes, and outside the land that someone had tried to take and failed. The fences sound, the garden growing, the grave in the back corner kept and honored, and no longer only grief settled into the dark of a late summer night in Montana, ordinary and irreplaceable, the way all the best things are. 3 months later, the territorial inquiry into the Yellowstone Valley Trust concluded with findings that led to the dissolution of the company and the filing of fraud charges against Carl Briggs and Helena. Gerald Garrett was found in Butte, operating under a different name. The charges followed him there. 2 of the 4 families, the Hendersons in Gallatin County, and a widow named Frances Oakes from further east, recovered portions of what their land had been worth. It was not everything. It was never going to be everything. But it was something, and Alcott wrote to Clayton to tell him so, and Clayton read the letter at the kitchen table and handed it to Evelyn, and she read it and set it down and said, "Good." Which was exactly what he had said, which was how they had come to speak in the same cadences, finishing each other's silences, knowing which things needed words and which things just needed the other person in the room. Denny learned the pasture rotation. He complained as predicted. He got it right by the 4th attempt, which Evelyn told him was faster than most people, which was generous but not entirely inaccurate. Old Lou's hip had a good winter. He credited the corner chair and Walt's cooking in that order. Thomas Bell came to dinner on Tuesdays and Fridays without fail, and on a Thursday in October he arrived with the news that he had received a letter from a woman in Missoula whose acquaintance he had made at the county cattle fair in September, and he said this piece of information to the table at large with the careful neutrality of a man who did not want anyone making a production of it. Clayton said, "Is that right?" Evelyn said, "What's her name?" Thomas said, "Helen." They both looked at him. "She raises cattle," he said. "She's practical. She has opinions about fence design." "Lord help you," Clayton said. "I think that's the idea," Thomas said, and helped himself to more of Walt's bread. In the spring, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. It was from a woman Evelyn had known years ago, a friend from her teaching days there, who wrote with the cheerful thoroughness of someone who had tracked down a lost person and was pleased about it. The letter described the city in winter, the new school term, the mutual friends, and then said toward the end, "Almost in passing, I heard from Caroline Whitfield. She asked if I'd heard from you. I told her I had not. I hope wherever you are well, and more than well." Evelyn read the letter at the kitchen table. Clayton watched her face. "Something wrong," he said. "No," she said. She set the letter down. "Someone from before, asking about me through a friend." He waited. "James's wife," she said. "The cousin." She looked at the letter for a moment. "She asked after me." "What does that mean to you?" he said. She thought about it. She looked at the letter, and then at the curtained window, and then at Clayton across the table. "Nothing," she said. And it was true. It was completely, cleanly true, not performed, not managed, not a thing she had to work at. Just true. "Absolutely nothing." He nodded. She folded the letter, set it aside, and picked up her coffee. "The Billings trip is in 2 weeks," she said. "I told Denny to watch the south fence while I'm gone." "He'll forget." "I know. I told Pete to remind him." "Pete'll forget too." "I told Walt to remind Pete." He looked at her. "You went 4 deep." "I know my audience," she said. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh, but had become something she could reliably produce, which was one of the accomplishments she was most privately proud of. She wrote that in her notebook later day 189. Still making him laugh. That's the one I keep track of. And outside the spring came in over the Widow's Peak, the way spring came everywhere in Montana, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like a decision. The kind you make, and then you keep every ordinary day for the rest of your life.